My name is Voruk Sael, and I have watched 300 training cycles across 14 species. I have seen Kalthrine cadets faint from the weight of standard-issue rifles. I have watched Drivian soldiers weep openly when their targeting systems malfunctioned. I have observed Phyluxian trainees, beings with 4 arms and 2 brains, struggle to reload a basic sidearm under simulated combat pressure. Nothing in 300 cycles prepared me for what I witnessed during the human intake evaluation at Outpost Darren 9. Let me begin where all disasters begin. At the beginning. The intake shuttle arrived 17 minutes late. This was, apparently, a human tradition. Not the lateness itself, but the complete absence of shame attached to it. The Drivian cadets had been standing in formation for 19 minutes, their spines perfectly rigid, their expressions communicating deeply appropriate anxiety about punctuality. The humans stepped off the shuttle like they were disembarking at a vacation resort. There were 6 of them. My briefing documents said their names were Tobin Marsh, Dia Ferris, Cale Oren, Preet Shan, Lena Voss, and one whose name my translator struggled with initially before settling on Zara Beck. Tobin Marsh walked off first. He was tall, loose in his movements, and he was eating something wrapped in silver material. Eating. During intake arrival. He looked at the assembled crowd of cadets, instructors, and station personnel, nodded like a man acknowledging acquaintances at a social gathering, and stepped to the side to let the others pass. Dia Ferris came second. She was shorter, with close-cropped hair and the kind of eyes that seemed to be calculating something at all times. She walked like she already knew where everything was. Then came the other 3 in a loose cluster, talking quietly among themselves, which was apparently also acceptable behavior during formal military intake procedures on the human homeworld, or so I assumed. And last, because of course she was last, came Zara Beck. She was not the largest human I had ever processed. She was not the most physically intimidating, or the most decorated, or the most anything that would justify the amount of time I subsequently spent thinking about her. She was average in height for her species. Her hair was pulled back in a tight wrap. Her uniform was pressed, but she was carrying something on her back that was not standard issue. Every cadet had their assigned kit. The Darren 9 regulation training rifle, compact and uniform, balanced for multi-species grip ergonomics. Every cadet had the same pack, same sidearm holster, same boot configuration. Zara Beck had all of that. Plus, something else. It was a case. Long, rectangular, matte black, with a combination of magnetic clasps and manual locks that I counted quickly. 7. 7 locks on a case that, by its dimensions, held a rifle approximately 30% longer than the standard training issue. I noted this, I filed it. I said nothing, because my role at that stage was observation and documentation, not interrogation. My colleague, Instructor Fane Dorvac, had no such restraint. Fane Dorvac was Kalthrine. His species stood roughly 2 meters tall, had 4 eyes arranged for nearly 360-degree vision, and had a professional personality that could most accurately be described as a wall with opinions. He had been running intake evaluations at Darren 9 for 11 cycles. He had broken 7 cadets psychologically in those 11 cycles, all 6 of which occurred in the first 3 days of training. He considered this a point of pride. He walked directly to Zara Beck before she had fully cleared the shuttle ramp. "Cadet," he said, in the clipped, formal tone that he used to make even greetings sound like accusation.
"What is that?"
Zara Beck looked at him. Then she looked at the case on her back, as if genuinely considering whether to pretend she had not noticed it. "Was there?" "Personal equipment," she said. "Personal equipment," Fane Dorvac repeated. "Yes." This facility issues all required equipment. I know. Your personal equipment is therefore unnecessary. It is not unnecessary to me, she said, pleasantly. The way you might disagree with someone about whether a particular vegetable was worth eating. Fane Dorvac stared at her. In 11 cycles, I had never seen a cadet respond to his opening interrogation with pleasantness. Most went pale. Some apologized before he had even finished speaking. 2 had asked to return to their homeworlds. He stared at her for 6 full seconds, which in Calthrine social interaction is approximately the equivalent of issuing a formal declaration of war. And then he said, "You will submit it to equipment storage." "I will not," she said. The Drivian cadets audibly stopped breathing. Tobin Marsh, still eating his wrapped food item, looked at the sky. "Cadet Beck," Fane Dorvac said, slowly, with the particular careful tone of someone who is being very deliberate about not raising their voice, because they know if they raise their voice, they will not stop. "You are currently standing at an active military training installation, and you are refusing a direct instruction from an evaluation officer. I am requesting that my personal equipment accompany me through intake. Yes." "That is not a request. That was a refusal." "It was a polite refusal," she clarified. "There is a difference." There was a sound from the cluster of humans behind her. It might have been Kyle Oren suppressing a laugh. I cannot confirm this. What I can confirm is that Fane Dorvac turned slowly to look at the cluster, then turned back, and then said with magnificent professional control, "You have until 600 tomorrow to submit the case to storage or have it transported off facility. If it remains in your possession after that time, you will be held in violation of intake regulation. 7 Darren, subsection C." "Noted," she said. And then she walked past him and into the facility. She kept the case. I know. I was watching. It sat in the corner of her bunk assignment with all 7 locks intact. The other humans in her intake group did not seem particularly surprised by this. Diaferis glanced at it once, nodded like this confirmed something she had already suspected, and went back to calibrating her sidearm. Preet Shan asked her one question. "You brought it?" And Zara Beck said, "I brought it." And that was apparently the entire conversation. The Drivian cadet assigned to the adjacent bunk, a young male named Rel Aven, who was earnest to the point of being painful to observe, spent approximately 40 minutes staring at the case before finally asking what it was. "A rifle," Zara Beck said. "Why does it have 7 locks?" "Because I have 7 fingers." Rel Aven looked at her hands. Humans have 5 fingers, as any xenobiologist could confirm. He opened his mouth and then decided, against following that particular line of inquiry, "I thought this showed considerable wisdom." Day 1 of formal evaluation began at 0500 hours. The first module was physical conditioning, which was universally despised by every species except, apparently, humans, who treated it with a range of attitudes from cheerful indifference to something that looked disturbingly like enthusiasm. Tobin Marsh completed the obstacle course twice, the second time apparently just to see if he could do it faster. He could. The second module was basic weapons handling. This was where things became interesting. All cadets were issued their regulation training rifles and directed to the practice range. The range supervisor, a veteran Pholuxian soldier named Gorath, who I had worked with for 6 cycles, walked down the line demonstrating grip position, stance, and basic sight alignment. Every cadet followed these demonstrations with appropriate seriousness. The regulation rifle was not a complex weapon, but it was unfamiliar to most species on first handling, and proper form took time to develop. Zara Beck did not use the regulation rifle. She had the case open before Gorath had finished his demonstration. She assembled the rifle inside it with the practiced movements of someone who had performed this action thousands of times in the dark, underwater, while asleep, and in descending order of difficulty. By the time Gorath called the range to begin their first grouping exercise, she was standing at her station with a rifle that was longer than anyone else's, thinner in the barrel, fitted with a scope that caught the light strangely, and braced on a bipod that she had unfolded and set into the ground with a single smooth motion. The cadets nearest to her physically moved away. Not because of any threat, but in the way you move when you want to be able to observe something clearly without being in the way. Gorath walked to her station. He looked at the rifle. He looked at her. He looked at the rifle again. Cadet Beck. Instructor. That is not the assigned training weapon. No, she agreed. This is a standardized evaluation exercise. I understand. You are required to use the standardized training weapon. Zara Beck looked at the regulation rifle sitting unclaimed at the side of her station. Then she looked at her own. Then she looked at Gorath with an expression that, in human social communication, I have come to understand signals the presence of an opinion that is being carefully restrained. Instructor, she said, I can complete the exercise with either weapon. I would prefer to use my own. The scoring parameters are calibrated for the regulation rifle. Then score me on the regulation rifle targets, and I will fire from this platform. Gorath was quiet for a moment. I could see him performing the internal calculation that experienced military instructors do when confronted with a situation that is technically outside the rulebook, but is not technically prohibited by the rulebook either. The regulation stated cadets must engage the regulation targets. It did not specifically prohibit using a different weapon to do so. He stepped back. First grouping. 10 rounds. Standard distance. Begin when ready. The range was noisy. It always was, with 60-odd cadets firing simultaneously. The crack and thud of training rifles filled the space with appropriate chaos. From Zara Beck's station, there was a different sound, quieter, measured. Each shot separated from the next by a pause that was precise rather than hesitant. Not the rapid-fire burst of a cadet trying to get their rounds downrange quickly. Something slower, deliberate. I was watching the targets. I should not have been. My documentation duties were on the cadets' form and stance, not on the targets themselves. But I was watching the targets, and I saw what happened, and I am going to tell you what I saw. 10 shots. All 10 inside the central grouping zone. Not scattered, at the edges. Not spread across the acceptable zone. Centered. A cluster so tight that at standard observation distance, the scoring system initially returned an error because it had not accounted for the possibility of that density. The cadets nearest to her stopped firing. Gorath walked to the target display. He stood in front of it. He did not speak for a while. The Dravian cadet to Zara Beck's left, a female named Suri Talon, who had been performing admirably herself, looked at the display, then at Zara Beck, then back at the display. What, Suri Talon said, is that? 10 rounds, Zara Beck said. Standard distance. That is not a standard grouping. No, that is not possible with a rifle. It was possible with mine. At the end of the range, 3 stations down, Tobin Marsh was grinning. He had watched the entire thing over his shoulder while maintaining his own fire. He had, I noted, also achieved excellent groupings, though not quite of that caliber. He looked like a man, watching a prank he had been in on from the beginning. Gorath turned from the target display. He looked at Zara Beck for a long, careful moment. Cadet Beck, he said, and his voice had changed. It no longer had the practiced authority of an instructor managing a situation. It had something else. something closer to the quiet tone of a professional recognizing another professional. "Where did you train?" "Holbrook Rifle Academy," she said. "Mountain Division." Gorath went still. I did not know what Holbrook Rifle Academy was. I made a note to find out. Whatever it was, Gorath knew it. And whatever he knew about it had changed something in how he was standing. He looked at the rifle in her hands, at the bipod, at the scope, at the 7-locked case still sitting open at her feet. "That scope," he said. "What is the range calibration?" "Adjusted for wind and elevation. Current facility settings plus 800 meters. This range is 200 meters. "I know." Gorath was quiet for another moment. Then he said something I had never, in 6 cycles of working with him, heard him say to a first-day cadet. "Carry on," he said, and he walked away. The laughter started at evening meal. Not from the humans, from a cluster of Calthrine cadets who had apparently spent the afternoon sharing observations about the human intake group with editorial commentary. The particular target of their amusement was, predictably, the rifle case. I heard the specific comment because I was nearby, and because the Calthrine cadet who made it had not yet learned to modulate his volume for proximity. "She carries that stabilizer like it is something special," he said. "It is a long stick with glass on top. My kin sibling could build one." His companions found this amusing. Zara Beck was 3 tables away. Whether she heard this, I cannot confirm. Her expression did not change. She continued eating. Dia Ferris, sitting across from her, looked briefly in the direction of the laughter, then looked back down at her food with a small, private expression that I could not quite categorize. Kyle Oren, sitting at the end of the table, did not look up at all. He simply said, quietly, mostly to his plate, "Give it a week." Nobody asked him what he meant, but I thought about it. The second day began with silence, which was unusual. Mornings at Darren 9 were typically loud. Equipment checks, verbal confirmations, the overlapping sounds of 60-plus cadets navigating a shared facility in the compressed time frame of pre-dawn preparation. Sound was the baseline. Silence was a symptom. I noticed it at 0445 when I arrived at the observation deck overlooking the Eastern Training Quad. The quad should have been empty. It was not. Zara Beck was already there. She had the bipod planted in the far corner of the quad, where the angle gave a clear line across the full diagonal length of the space. She was lying flat, completely still, with the rifle settled against her shoulder and her eye at the scope. She was not firing. She was watching. For 40 minutes, she did not move. I have observed snipers in field documentation before. Not many, because sniper certification programs are rare and exclusive regardless of species. But I have observed the particular stillness that long-range specialists develop, the way they seem to unhook from the normal biological rhythms of breathing and shifting and existing in a body with needs and discomforts. It is not natural stillness. It is practiced stillness, earned stillness, the kind that takes years to build and looks, to the untrained eye, like the cadet has simply fallen asleep in an inconvenient location. I stood on the observation deck and watched her not move for 40 minutes. At 0527, 3 minutes before the general wake signal, she stood up, collapsed the bipod with one click, picked up the rifle, and walked back inside. She had not fired a single shot. I made a note. Then I made another note. Then I looked at what Gorath had said the previous day and made a connection that I should perhaps have made earlier. 800 meters. She had calibrated for 800 meters in a 200-meter facility. I went to find the facility maps, The second evaluation module was tactical movement, which involved navigating a simulated urban environment while responding to variable threat scenarios. It was designed to test decision-making under pressure, not marksmanship. Weapons were carried, but scoring was based on route selection, communication choices, and response timing. Most cadets found this module more comfortable than pure marksmanship because it rewarded adaptability rather than precision. The humans found it deeply comfortable, which was not surprising to me at that point. Tobin Marsh moved through the simulated environment like he had grown up in it, which, given what I had subsequently learned about human frontier settlement patterns, he possibly had. He made 3 unconventional route choices that the scenario designers had not anticipated and arrived at the extraction point 40 seconds before the next fastest cadet. Dia Ferris did not move quickly. She moved quietly. There is a difference. Speed creates noise. Quiet creates outcomes. She neutralized 4 scenario elements that other cadets had simply avoided, because she seemed to understand that leaving problems behind you is not the same as solving them. Kyle Oren got lost for 11 minutes, which sounded like a failure until the scenario review revealed that he had gotten lost deliberately, drawing 2 simulated pursuers away from the rest of his team element in a corridor that conveniently ended at a scenario-valid neutralization point. When the module supervisor pointed this out during review, Kale shrugged and said he had taken a wrong turn. Nobody believed him. And Zara Beck. Zara Beck spent the entire tactical module on high ground. Every simulated urban environment has high ground. Rooftops, elevated. Platforms, structural overhangs. The module designers included them for environmental variety, and because some species have natural elevation preferences. They were not designed as primary tactical positions for this exercise. Zara Beck treated them as primary tactical positions for this exercise. She moved to elevation at the first opportunity, found an angle that covered the primary approach corridor, set the bipod, and did not move again for the duration of the scenario. Her team element, which included Rel Avin and 2 Drivian cadets, completed their objective without encountering a single simulated threat. Because every time a threat element moved into the corridor, it was marked neutralized by the scenario system before it could engage them. At the scenario review, the module supervisor pulled up her position data. He stared at it for a while. Then he looked at her. "You never moved from the initial elevation point," he said. "No need to," she said. "The objective required movement through 3 scenario zones. My team covered 3 scenario zones. I covered my team." The supervisor looked at the data again. Then he said, "Your team completed the objective with 0 simulated casualties and the fastest recorded time in this module for this intake cycle." "Yes," she said. "You are aware that the individual scoring metrics for this module reward personal movement and engagement numbers." "I am aware. Your personal scores will be low." "My team's scores will not be," she said, and there was no argument in her voice. Just fact. Just the quiet confidence of someone who had already done the calculation and was comfortable with the result. Rel Avin, sitting beside her during the review, looked at her sideways. He had the expression of someone revising an opinion they had held for a short but confident period of time. The laughter from the Caltrine cadets had not stopped. If anything, it had grown more organized. There is something that happens in group training environments across almost every species I have documented. The formation of informal social hierarchies that attach themselves to visible markers of difference. The case was Zara Beck's visible marker. It was large, it was different, and she defended it with a pleasantness that some cadets apparently found more irritating than direct confrontation would have been. The specific nickname they had developed by day 3 was not translatable in a way that preserved its full dismissive weight, but the closest equivalent in standard was the girl with the fancy stick. This was shared widely enough that even some of the non-Calthrine cadets had begun using it, with varying degrees of genuine cruelty and casual thoughtlessness. Zara Beck heard it. She was not deaf. She did not react to it in any way that gave the name-callers the reaction they were looking for, which I suspected was the correct tactical response, even if it was also personally costly. Diapharis, however, had begun keeping a list. I know this because I observed her writing in a small physical notebook. Humans maintained some archaic physical documentation habits that I found both charming and puzzling. And when Tobin Marsh asked her what she was writing, she said, "Names," he said. "What for?" she said. "Reference." He nodded and went back to eating. I did not know what the list was for at the time. I found out later. It was a record of every cadet who had used the nickname. She was not planning revenge. She explained to me much later when I asked directly, documenting what she called who we will need to work hardest to trust in a real scenario. She was not angry at them. She was noting, for practical purposes, that people who mock what they do not understand are people who will hesitate when they encounter it under pressure. And hesitation, in her operational vocabulary, was the enemy. Practical. Coldly. Impressively practical. I was beginning to understand why these 6 humans had been selected for the Darren 9 intake program. Day 4 brought the long-range qualification test. This was not standard for the intake cycle. Long-range qualification was a specialist evaluation, typically reserved for cadets who had already completed basic and intermediate training. It was administered usually in the 3rd month of a standard program. The reason it appeared on Day 4 was because of a communication that arrived on Day 3, addressed to the facility commander. From an authority level I was not briefed to receive details about. What I was told in the morning coordination meeting was that the long-range qualification range would be opened for 1 day, and that any cadet who wished to attempt it could do so on a voluntary basis with scores logged to permanent record. The facility commander made this announcement at morning formation. Most cadets exchanged confused looks. Long-range qualification was famously difficult. Attempting it in the first week of intake, before any formal instruction, would almost certainly produce poor scores, and poor scores on permanent record were not desirable. Almost no hands went up. Zara Beck's hand went up immediately. Cale Oren's hand went up immediately after, which surprised everyone, including, briefly, himself. Preet Shan raised her hand slowly, looked around, and then raised it fully. The Calthrine cadet who had coined the Fancy Stick nickname raised his hand too, for reasons I suspected had more to do with not wanting to appear unwilling than genuine confidence. His name was Dren Salak, and he had, according to his file, perfectly adequate marksmanship scores at standard distance. 4 cadets, 1 range, 1 qualification standard. The long-range facility was on the north side of the outpost. I had looked at the maps the previous night. The north range extended 840 meters to the target wall. Standard qualification required engagement of primary targets at 600 meters, with a secondary set at 750. Expert qualification extended to the full 840. When we arrived at the range, the head range officer, a veteran named Instructor Marak Ossel, was waiting. Marak Ossel was not like Gorath. Where Gorath was professional and precise, Marak Ossel had the weathered quality of someone who had seen enough combat to have developed very specific opinions about what mattered and what did not. He looked at the 4 cadets who had volunteered. He looked at them the way someone looks at a list of groceries when they are not sure it is the right list. He looked at Zara Beck's rifle. He went very still. The stillness lasted long enough that Dren Salak, standing nearest to him, took a small step back. Marak Osel walked to Zara Beck. He walked around her slowly, looking at the rifle from multiple angles, with an expression that was shifting through several phases too quickly for me to catalog all of them. He stopped in front of her. "Cadet," he said. "Instructor," she said. "Where did you get that scope fitting?" "Custom mount, Holbrook specification." Something moved through his expression at the name Holbrook. The same thing that had moved through Gorath's expression 2 days earlier, but deeper. More weighted. "That bipod anchor," he said, "that is not a standard configuration." "No, sir. That is a Wesson pattern anchor, variable tension, used for field adjustment on uneven ground." "Yes, sir." "Wesson pattern anchors are manufactured in one facility in the northern range territories of your homeworld." He paused. "They are available for purchase to the general public, technically. In practice, the waiting list is 4 years. Military procurement skips the list." Another pause. "Procurement for special operations certification programs skips military procurement." Zara Beck said nothing. She looked at him with a calm, steady expression that was giving away absolutely nothing. Marak Osel looked at the rifle again. At the scope. At the case she was carrying on her back. He looked at her hands, then at her eyes, and his expression settled into something I had seen on the faces of very experienced professionals when they recognize something they did not expect to find in a particular place. He turned to look at the other 3 cadets. "You 3, he said. "Standard evaluation. 200 meters, then 400. Proceed to lane assignments." They moved. Dren Salak moved with particular speed, apparently relieved to have a clear instruction. Marak Osel turned back to Zara Beck. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said it. He said it with the flat, certain tone of a man reading information from a document he had personally written, and therefore did not need to verify. "Only snipers use that anchor configuration." The range was momentarily quiet enough that the wind carried the words sideways along the firing line. Zara Beck looked at him. Then she said, "The evaluation, sir." "Full range," he said. 840. All target sets." "Yes, sir." He stepped back and did not say anything else. She set the bipod. She adjusted the anchor points with 3 small movements. She settled behind the rifle, aligned her breathing, and was still. What followed was not dramatic in the way that performances are dramatic. There were no flourishes, no speeches, no visible effort. Each shot arrived at its logical conclusion from a chain of invisible preparations. The stillness, the breathing, the calculations she had been running since 0445 2 mornings ago, when she spent 40 minutes watching the quad and learning the wind. 600 meters. Every target. Then 750. Every target. Then 840. The final target set at 840 was not mandatory for qualification. It was logged separately, under a different scoring category, marked in the range documentation with a notation that most range officers never had cause to record. Marak Osel recorded it. He walked down the range after she finished. He checked the target confirmations on his data tablet. He walked back without urgency. He stood beside her while she broke down the rifle and returned it to the case, locking each of the 7 locks in sequence. Dren Salak had finished his evaluation. He had done adequately at 200 meters and poorly at 4. He was standing a short distance away, waiting for release, and he was watching. His expression had traveled a significant distance from where it had been 3 days ago, when he coined the nickname that had spread through the intake group. Marak Osel did not speak to Dren Salak. He did not address the group. He waited until Zara Beck had secured the final lock on the case and straightened up. Then, in the same flat, even tone he had used for every statement since they arrived at the range, he said, "Your scores will be filed under Specialist Track. You will receive a separate briefing tomorrow regarding program placement." "Thank you, sir," she said. He nodded, once. The nod of one professional acknowledging another, stripped of everything that was not essential. He walked away. The nickname stopped that afternoon. Not because anyone announced that it should stop. Not because Zara Beck said anything about it. Or because Dia Ferris revealed her list. Or because any formal instruction was issued. It stopped because Dren Selek came back from the North Range and said nothing for the rest of the day, and because when someone at the evening meal used the phrase "fancy stick" in a casual aside, the person sitting next to them said, "Stop," and they stopped. Information travels fast in contained training environments. What Marek Ossel had said traveled faster than most. Only snipers use that configuration. And what nobody in the Calthrine group had known, and what most of the Drivian cadets had not known, and what several of the human cadets had apparently known from the beginning, and had chosen not to announce, was the full meaning of that sentence. There were two programs at Darren 9, the Standard Intake Program, which led to General Service Certification, and which all 60-odd cadets had believed they were enrolled in, and a second program, which did not appear on the standard intake documentation, which had no visible enrollment process, and which accepted candidates by a selection mechanism that was never publicly explained. Zara Beck had already been in the second program when she stepped off that shuttle. The case, the locks, the Wesson pattern anchor, the scope calibrated for 800 meters in a 200-meter facility. The 40 minutes lying still in the empty quad, watching the wind move across the diagonal of a training yard she had never visited before. None of it was preparation for the standard intake evaluation. All of it was continuation of training that had been happening somewhere else, for a different purpose, with a different endpoint. She had come to Darren 9 not to begin something. She had come to complete a transition between one stage of something and the next. Rel Avin sat with her at the evening meal for the first time that night. He had been working up to it for 2 days, in the visible way that earnest people work up to things they consider significant. He sat down with his tray and looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," she said. "Did you know we were watching you? All of us. When you did the long range today. Were you aware of it?" "Yes," she said. "Did it affect your performance?" "No." He was quiet, processing this. "How did you make it not affect you?" She considered the question with more genuine attention than she gave most things. Then she said, "I decided what I was aiming at before I arrived. Once you know what you are aiming at, everything else is noise. Noise does not change the target." Rel Avin wrote this down in his own notebook, a habit he had apparently developed in the last 4 days. From across the table, Cale Oren, without looking up from his meal, said, "She's been saying things like that the whole week, by the way. You might want a bigger notebook." Zara Beck did not smile at this. She looked at Cale Oren with the steady, amused expression of someone who has accepted that other people will find them interesting and has simply decided not to let it slow them down. I filed my final intake observation report for the Darren 9 cycle 12 days later. In the standard summary section, where I recorded notable behavioral patterns and performance flags for administrative review, I wrote the following: Human cadet Zara Beck arrived at intake carrying specialist equipment calibrated beyond facility parameters. Initial interactions with instructors Dorvac and Gorath established a pattern of polite, consistent non-compliance with standard procedures that was, in retrospect, not non-compliance at all. It was the behavior of a specialist operating within a facility that had not yet been made aware of her classification. Recommend review of intake communication protocols to ensure specialist track candidates are flagged to receiving officers prior to arrival. This would prevent the 3 days of procedural friction that occurred and would also, notably, prevent the social dynamics that developed among the general intake population, which wasted significant group energy on a misunderstanding. I paused before submitting the report. Then I added one more line. It would also spare the relevant cadets the specific experience of publicly mocking a qualification they do not understand, which was, in this observer's professional opinion, an educational experience for all involved, but not one that reflects well on the facility's intake culture. I submitted the report. I had, in 300 training cycles across 14 species, watched countless cadets arrive with ambition and leave with credentials. I had watched very few arrive already holding something that the facility was only beginning to understand. Zara Beck had not come to Darren 9 to be evaluated. She had come to be assigned. There is a difference, and by the time anyone thought to laugh at the case again, she was already 3 levels above the people who had been laughing.